The sun was just beginning to rise over the marina, casting a warm golden hue across the water. It was a perfect morning, the kind that made you believe anything was possible. The air was crisp, with just a hint of salt, and the boats bobbed gently in the harbor, their sails neatly folded, waiting for the day's competition to begin. I stood on the dock, watching as my wife Jessica boarded her yacht with an effortless grace that I had always admired. She was in her element here, surrounded by the sleek white vessels and the murmur of the sea. I could see the excitement in her eyes, the way her smile widened as she exchanged greetings with her crew. This was her passion, her world. I was just a spectator, proud and a little in awe. "Mike, are you coming up?" she called to me, her voice bright with anticipation. She was already dressed in her sailing gear, the windbreaker snug against her athletic frame, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that danced in the breeze. She looked beautiful, radiant even, and I felt a pang of something, maybe envy, maybe something deeper, as I realized just how much she belonged out there, on the water, more than she ever had with me. "Nah, I'll stay down here for now," I replied, waving her off with a smile that I hoped hid the uncertainty I felt. "You've got enough to worry about without me underfoot." Jessica gave me a quick nod, her attention already shifting back to the yacht. I watched as she and her crew moved about the deck, preparing for the race with a practiced efficiency that spoke to the countless hours they'd spent together. I knew how much this meant to her, how much she'd invested in this competition, both emotionally and physically. It was her dream, and I was determined not to let my insecurities ruin it. As I wandered along the dock, my mind drifted back to the last few months. Things had been different between us. Subtle changes at first. She'd been more distant, more preoccupied, and there were nights when she came home later than usual, always with an excuse about the yacht or the crew. I told myself it was just stress, that the pressure of the upcoming race was weighing on her, but there was a nagging doubt that I couldn't shake. Something was off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I stopped at the end of the dock, where a group of other spectators had gathered, all waiting to catch a glimpse of the action. That's when I saw him. Daniel, the captain of one of the other yachts. He was tall, with a confident stride, and a commanding presence that seemed to draw people to him. I'd seen him around the marina before, but we'd never spoken. Today, though, he was different. Today he was laughing with Jessica. She stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the railing as they talked, their heads close together. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way she looked at him, with that same easy smile that she used to give me, sent a chill through me. They seemed too familiar, too comfortable, and I felt a surge of something dark and unwelcome gnaw at my insides. Trying to brush it off, I turned away and pretended to focus on the other yachts preparing for the race. But the image of them together lingered, etched into my mind like a stubborn stain. Was I imagining things? Was I letting my paranoia get the better of me? I didn't want to believe that anything was wrong, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. The sound of a horn blaring snapped me back to reality, signaling the start of the race. The yachts began to move out of the harbor, their sails unfurling as they caught the wind. I watched as Jessica's yacht glided gracefully across the water, her crew moving in perfect harmony, guided by her steady hand. She looked alive, more alive than I had seen her in months, and it made my heart ache. But even as I cheered for her, that image of her and Daniel kept replaying in my mind, like a broken record that I couldn't turn off. I didn't know what to think or what to feel, and it left me standing there, alone on the dock, wondering if this race was the beginning of something wonderful for Jessica or the end of everything for us. The first race of the competition ended with Jessica's team securing a respectable second place. As the yachts returned to the marina, the air was thick with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Sailors disembarked, high-fiving and exchanging stories of close calls and tactical maneuvers. Jessica was glowing with pride, her smile as wide as the horizon, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for her, despite the unease gnawing at my gut. We walked back to the car together, her energy contagious as she recounted the day's events. But as much as I tried to stay engaged, I found myself distracted, my thoughts returning to the scene from earlier, the one where she had been talking with Daniel. I wanted to ask her about it, to bring it up casually and see her reaction, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I might discover. Or maybe it was just the fact that today was supposed to be a good day. I didn't want to spoil it. So, there's a party tonight, Jessica said, interrupting my thoughts as she pulled off her cap and shook out her hair. Daniel's hosting it on his yacht. He invited us both. My stomach tightened. Daniel? I tried to keep my voice neutral, but I could hear the tension creeping in. The guy from the marina? Yeah, he's one of the top captains here. His team won today, so he's celebrating. It'll be fun, a chance to unwind after all the stress. There was an earnestness in her eyes, a hopefulness that made me hesitate. I didn't want to seem paranoid or possessive, but the idea of spending an evening on that yacht with Daniel and his crew didn't sit right with me. Sure, I said finally, forcing a smile. It sounds like fun. The party started just after sunset, the sky ablaze with oranges and pinks as we arrived at the marina. Daniel's yacht was larger than most, sleek and modern, with twinkling lights strung along the rails. The deck was already bustling with people, sailors, their families, and a few locals who had somehow made their way onto the guest list. Music played softly from hidden speakers, and the scent of grilled seafood wafted through the air. Jessica's eyes lit up as we approached, and she gave my hand a quick squeeze. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "It means a lot to me." I wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to that moment and push away all the doubts. But as we stepped on board, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an outsider in a world that was no longer mine. Daniel greeted us with a broad smile, his handshake firm and confident. He was charming, effortlessly so, and I could see why people were drawn to him. He welcomed us aboard, introducing us to his crew and a few other guests, all while keeping a casual arm around Jessica's shoulders. I noticed the way she leaned into him slightly, her body language more relaxed than I'd seen in weeks. As the night wore on, I found myself drifting to the edges of the party, a beer in hand, watching as Jessica and Daniel moved through the crowd. They laughed together, shared stories, and there were moments when their eyes would meet, and I'd feel that same cold knot of dread in my stomach. I was there, but I wasn't really part of it, an observer in a scene that felt increasingly surreal. At one point, I caught Jessica's eye from across the deck, and she smiled at me, a smile that was warm and genuine, but also distant. It was like she was trying to include me, to make me feel like I belonged, but the truth was I didn't, not here, not now. I made small talk with a few of the other guests, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I looked up, there she was, always with him, always laughing, always happy. It was like watching a different version of her, a version that I didn't know how to reach. When the party began to wind down, Daniel announced that the crew would be staying on board for the night, preparing for the next day's race. He offered to let Jessica stay as well, to get some rest and go over strategy with his team. I felt a sudden surge of panic, but before I could say anything, Jessica turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Would you mind?" she asked softly, her hand on my arm. "It'll just be for the night, and I'll be back early in the morning. I want to make sure we're ready." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her that she needed to come home with me, that we needed to talk, to reconnect. But I also knew that this was her world, her passion, and I couldn't be the one to take that away from her. "Of course," I said, my voice hollow. "I understand." She kissed me lightly on the cheek, thanked me, and I watched as she turned back to Daniel, who gave me a nod of appreciation. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a dagger. As I walked away from the yacht, the laughter and music fading into the distance, I couldn't help but feel that something vital had shifted between us. The marina was quiet, the night air cool against my skin, but inside, I felt a storm brewing. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if this was more than just a race, if I was losing her, piece by piece, to a life that no longer included me. The next morning, I woke up alone in our bed. The space beside me was cold, the sheets still neatly tucked in, as if Jessica had never been there. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the silence of the house seep into my bones. It was strange, how quickly you could get used to something, how quickly the absence of someone could become a presence of its own. I got up, moving through the motions of the morning routine with a mechanical efficiency. Shower, coffee, check emails, all while the gnawing sensation in my gut refused to fade. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind, like a movie reel stuck on repeat. Every smile Jessica gave Daniel, every laugh they shared, every moment where she seemed to be closer to him than she had been to me in months. They all played in an endless loop, each time more painful than the last. It wasn't just jealousy, though that was certainly a part of it. It was fear. Fear that I was losing her, that she was slipping away from me and into the arms of someone else. I knew that if I didn't confront it soon, it would fester and grow, poisoning whatever was left of our marriage. Around mid-morning, I decided to head down to the marina. Jessica had promised she'd be back early, and I wanted to be there when she returned. Maybe we could grab breakfast together, spend some time reconnecting before the next race. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The marina was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Crews were busy prepping their yachts for the day's race, their voices carrying across the water in a steady hum. I scanned the docks for any sign of Jessica, but she was nowhere to be seen. I walked over to the spot where her yacht was moored, hoping to catch her before she headed out. As I approached, I spotted Daniel standing on the deck of his yacht, his back to me as he talked with one of his crew members. I hesitated, torn between the urge to confront him and the desire to avoid making a scene. But before I could decide, Jessica appeared from below deck, her face lighting up as she saw me. "Mike, I didn't expect you so early," she said, walking over to meet me on the dock. There was a hint of surprise in her voice, but also something else, something that sounded almost like guilt. "I wanted to see you before the race," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Maybe grab some breakfast?" She glanced back at Daniel, who gave her a brief nod before turning away. When she looked back at me, her smile was tight, strained. "I'd love to, but we've got a strategy meeting in a few minutes. It's really important that we go over everything before we head out." I tried to hide my disappointment, but I knew she could see it in my eyes. "Sure, I get it. Maybe later then?" "Definitely later," she said quickly as if to reassure me. "We'll celebrate after the race, okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile as I watched her walk away. She joined Daniel on his yacht, and they disappeared below deck together, leaving me standing there on the dock, feeling more like a stranger in my own life than ever before. I spent the next few hours wandering around the marina, trying to distract myself from the growing unease that churned in my gut. I watched the yachts prepare for the race, chatted with a few of the other spectators, and even tried to lose myself in the buzz of excitement that filled the air. But nothing could shake the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. As the race began, I found a spot near the water's edge where I could watch Jessica's yacht. The wind had picked up, filling the sails and propelling the boats forward in a graceful dance across the waves. Jessica was at the helm, her focus intense, her hands steady on the wheel. She was in her element, and for a moment, I felt a pang of pride that was quickly overshadowed by the memory of her and Daniel together. The race was close, the yachts neck and neck as they rounded the final marker and headed toward the finish line. Jessica's team was in the lead, but only by a hair. I held my breath, willing them to push through, to claim the victory that I knew she so desperately wanted. In the end, they crossed the finish line just seconds ahead of the second-place yacht. The crowd erupted into cheers, and I felt a surge of relief, not just for the win, but for the hope that maybe, just maybe, this would bring us back together. I made my way down to the docks, eager to congratulate Jessica and share in her triumph. But as I approached her yacht, I saw her standing with Daniel, their heads close together as they talked in hushed tones. There was an intimacy in the way they stood, a familiarity that cut deep into my heart. They didn't see me at first, and for a moment I just stood there, watching them. It was like looking through a window into a world that I didn't belong to, a world that had once been mine but was now slipping through my fingers. When Jessica finally noticed me, she pulled away from Daniel, her smile bright but strained. "Mike, we did it!" she exclaimed, coming over to me and wrapping her arms around my neck. I hugged her back, but it felt different, like she was holding something back, like there was a wall between us that I couldn't breach. I looked over her shoulder at Daniel, who gave me a polite nod before turning away, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. "Yeah, you did," I said, pulling back to look at her. "I'm proud of you." Her smile faltered for a moment, just a flicker, but it was enough to send a cold wave of doubt crashing over me. "Thanks," she said softly, her eyes darting away from mine. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the way she was acting, it was something deeper, something that I couldn't put my finger on. And as much as I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid, I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that Jessica was hiding something from me, something that could tear us apart. The days that followed were a blur of races, strategy meetings, and late nights at the marina. Jessica was more focused than ever, throwing herself into the competition with a single-minded determination that left little room for anything else, including me. She was always on the move, always busy, always just out of reach. I tried to be supportive, tried to give her the space she needed to succeed. But the more I tried to be understanding, the more isolated I felt. Our conversations became shorter, more perfunctory, as if we were checking off boxes on a to-do list. The intimacy we once shared, the easy laughter, the late-night talks, the simple joy of being together, had been replaced by a growing chasm that neither of us seemed willing or able to cross. One night, after another long day at the marina, I found myself sitting alone in our living room, nursing a glass of whiskey as I stared at the blank television screen. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as I shifted in my seat. Jessica was still at the marina, or so she'd said. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, that wanted to trust that she was just working late, that she was just tired, that she was just busy. But there was another part of me, the part that had seen the way she looked at Daniel, the part that had felt the distance growing between us, that couldn't ignore the possibility that she was lying to me, that she was with him right now, doing God knows what. I took another sip of whiskey, the burn in my throat doing little to numb the ache in my chest. I was tired of waiting, tired of wondering, tired of pretending that everything was okay when it so clearly wasn't. I needed answers, and I needed them now. On impulse, I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. I stared at the screen, the silence of the house pressing in on me from all sides. I knew I shouldn't do it, knew I should just wait until she came home and talk to her like an adult. But the fear, the doubt, the gnawing uncertainty, it all got the better of me. I opened the tracking app on my phone, the one we'd installed years ago for safety reasons, in case one of us ever got lost or stranded. It wasn't something I ever used, not unless I had to. But tonight, I needed to know where she was. The screen loaded slowly, the little spinning wheel of anticipation mocking my desperation. And then there it was, a small blinking dot on the map, showing me exactly where Jessica was. She wasn't at the marina. She wasn't anywhere near it. She was at a location I didn't recognize, a residential area on the other side of town. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. I should have stopped there, should have put the phone down and waited for her to come home. But the fear had its claws in me, and I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was going on. I needed to see it for myself. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. The drive was a blur, the streets, the lights, the buildings all passing by in a haze as I followed the blinking dot on my phone. It felt like I was in a dream, like I was watching myself from a distance, disconnected from the reality of what I was doing. When I finally reached the address, I parked a few houses down and killed the engine. The street was quiet, the houses dark except for a few porch lights casting long shadows across the pavement. I looked at the map again, confirming that this was the place. Jessica's dot was still there, still blinking, still waiting for me to catch up. I got out of the car and walked slowly toward the house, my footsteps muffled by the night. My heart was in my throat, my hands clammy with sweat. I didn't know what I was expecting, didn't know what I was hoping to find. But as I approached the house, I saw it. Daniel's car parked in the driveway. My stomach dropped, a cold wave of realization washing over me. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, staring at the car, at the house, at the windows where I could see the faint glow of lights from inside. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink, about to plunge into a darkness from which there was no return. I forced myself to move, to take the steps that would lead me to the truth. I walked up the driveway, each step heavier than the last, until I was standing at the front door. My hand hovered over the doorbell, my finger trembling as I hesitated. I could hear voices from inside, muffled by the walls, but unmistakable. One of them was Jessica's. I pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing through the quiet night like a gunshot. The voices inside stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard footsteps, growing louder as they approached the door. The door opened, and there she was, Jessica, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. Behind her, I could see Daniel, standing in the hallway, his face unreadable. "Mike, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, choked by the betrayal that hung heavy in the air between us. I just stood there staring at her, at Daniel, at the life that I thought was ours, but was now slipping through my fingers. "Mike, I can explain," she started, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. It was over. Whatever we had, whatever we were, it was over. The world seemed to narrow down to that doorway, to the three of us standing frozen in place, the weight of unspoken words and shattered trust hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Jessica looked at me with a mix of guilt and desperation, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness, for something that I wasn't sure I could give. "Mike, please," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her hand, pull her away from this house and pretend that this was all just a horrible misunderstanding. But the evidence was right there in front of me. Her presence in Daniel's house, the late nights, the distant conversations, the way she had been slipping away from me, inch by inch. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. "Then what is it, Jessica?" I asked, my voice harsh even to my own ears. "What is this? Because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like what I think it is." She flinched, her hand coming up to her mouth as if to stifle a sob. Behind her, Daniel stepped forward, his expression a careful mask of concern. It made my blood boil, the calm, collected way he stood there, as if he hadn't just driven a wedge between my wife and me. "Mike, let's talk about this calmly," Daniel said, his voice annoyingly soothing. "This isn't the place for a confrontation." I turned my gaze on him, my fists clenching at my sides. "Don't you dare tell me how to handle this," I spat, the anger bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "You don't get to play the reasonable guy here. Not after everything you've done." Jessica stepped between us, her hand on my chest as if to hold me back. "Please, Mike, let's just go home and talk. We can work this out." "Work this out?" I repeated, my voice rising. "How are we supposed to work this out when you're here with him? When you've been lying to me for God knows how long?" She winced at my words, her eyes filling with tears. I wanted to reach out, to wipe them away, to comfort her like I always had before. But the pain in my chest was too much, the betrayal too raw. I couldn't just sweep this under the rug and pretend that everything was okay. "Please, Mike," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." I shook my head, stepping back from her, from them both. "You didn't mean for this to happen, but it did happen, Jessica. You made a choice, and now we're here." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the contact too painful, too intimate. "I love you, Mike," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never stopped loving you." Her words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to scream at her, to demand how she could say that when she was standing here, in another man's house, after everything she'd done. But all I could manage was a bitter laugh, the sound echoing through the quiet night. "If this is love," I said, my voice cold, "then I don't want it." The silence that followed was suffocating, the three of us standing there in the doorway, the world around us forgotten. I could see the devastation in Jessica's eyes, the realization that she had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, and that there was no going back. Finally, I took a step back, the distance between us feeling like a chasm that I didn't know how to bridge. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice flat. "You can stay here, or you can come home. But if you come home, we're going to have a very long, very difficult conversation." I turned and walked away, not waiting for her response. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't begin to sort out. I didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know if I could forgive her, if we could find a way to move past this. All I knew was that I needed space, needed time to process everything that had just happened. As I got into the car and drove away, the tears finally came. Hot, angry tears that blurred my vision and made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I felt like my world was falling apart, like everything I had believed in, everything I had trusted, had been ripped away from me in an instant. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just drove, trying to outrun the pain, the anger, the betrayal that threatened to swallow me whole. I woke up the next morning on the couch, my head pounding from the whiskey and the lack of sleep. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to piece together the events of the night before, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it had all been some terrible dream. But the memories came flooding back. The confrontation at Daniel's house, the look in Jessica's eyes, the cold, hard reality of what I had discovered. I groaned, rubbing my hands over my face as if I could scrub away the lingering ache that sat deep in my chest. I hadn't seen Jessica when I got home. I wasn't sure if she'd come back at all, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. I wasn't ready to face her, wasn't ready to have that conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We couldn't avoid it forever. I forced myself to get up, to shower, to make a pot of coffee. The mundane tasks felt like a lifeline, something to cling to in the midst of the emotional storm that was raging inside me. But even as I went through the motions, the pain was there, a constant throbbing presence that refused to be ignored. As I sat at the kitchen table, nursing my coffee, I heard the front door creak open. My heart skipped a beat, my stomach clenching as I braced myself for the confrontation that I knew was coming. Jessica walked into the kitchen, looking like she hadn't slept a wink. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face pale, and she seemed to hesitate in the doorway, as if unsure of how to proceed. I didn't say anything, didn't move. I just watched her, waiting for her to make the first move. "Mike," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from me. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes downcast. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, as we both struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry," she said after what felt like an eternity. "I'm so sorry, Mike. I never wanted to hurt you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "Then why, Jessica? Why did you do it?" She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was lonely, I guess. I felt like we were drifting apart, like you weren't really there anymore. And Daniel, he was just there. He listened, he understood. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the pain raw and searing. I wanted to scream, to rage at her, to make her feel the hurt that she had caused me. But all I could manage was a weary sigh. The fight drained out of me. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't. I never did. It was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake." I leaned back in my chair, staring at her, trying to make sense of everything. "Do you want to save this, Jess? Do you want to save us?" She nodded quickly, her eyes wide with desperation. "Yes, Mike, I want to save us. I want to fix this, to make it right." I didn't know if that was possible. I didn't know if I could ever trust her again, if I could ever look at her the same way. But there was a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that didn't want to give up, that didn't want to let this be the end. "Then we need to start over," I said, my voice firm. "We need to go to counseling, to talk about everything. Everything, Jessica. No more lies, no more secrets. If we're going to make this work, we need to rebuild from the ground up." She nodded again, her face a mixture of relief and fear. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mike, I promise." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had married. But she was different now, and so was I. We were both broken, both scarred by what had happened. I didn't know if we could ever be whole again, but I knew that I had to try. "We'll take it one day at a time," I said, my voice softer now. "But you need to understand, Jess, that this is going to be hard, really hard. And I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll see where this goes, I said. But for now, we just need to get through today. She squeezed my hand back, a flicker of hope in her eyes, and for the first time since I had found out, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. In the weeks that followed, Jessica and I tried to find a new normal. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, the slightest misstep threatening to send us crashing down into the abyss of our broken marriage. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was now fragile, like a piece of cracked glass that could shatter at any moment. We started going to counseling, just like we had agreed. Our therapist, Dr. Lewis, was a calm, patient woman who seemed to understand the weight of what we were going through. The sessions were tough, brutally honest, raw, and often painful. There were days when I didn't think I could do it, when I wanted to walk out of her office and never come back. But I kept going, because as hard as it was, I knew that if we had any chance of surviving this, we had to face the pain head on. The first few sessions were the hardest. Dr. Lewis encouraged us to talk openly about everything, the affair, the feelings that had led up to it, the fears and doubts that had been festering beneath the surface for so long. Jessica spoke about her loneliness, about how she had felt like I was drifting away from her, even before Daniel came into the picture. She talked about how she had found comfort in Daniel's attention, how it had made her feel seen, appreciated in a way that she hadn't felt in years. It was hard to hear, harder still to accept that I had played a part in pushing her away. But I couldn't deny that there was truth in her words. I had been distant, preoccupied with work and other responsibilities, taking our relationship for granted without realizing how much it was hurting her. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it helped me understand how we had gotten to this point. There were moments in those sessions when I wanted to lash out, to let my anger and pain consume me. But Dr. Lewis was always there to guide us back to the path of understanding, reminding us that if we wanted to heal, we had to be willing to listen to each other, to really hear what the other was saying. It wasn't just the therapy sessions that were difficult. Every day brought new challenges, new reminders of the cracks in our marriage. I found myself questioning everything. Every time Jessica's phone buzzed, every time she was late coming home, every time she mentioned a work meeting or an event at the marina. The paranoia was suffocating, and I hated the person it was turning me into. But I couldn't help it. The betrayal had left deep scars, and I wasn't sure if they would ever fully heal. Jessica tried her best to reassure me, to show me that she was committed to making things right. She was more attentive, more affectionate, more open than she had been in a long time. She made a point of including me in her plans, of being transparent about her schedule, of going out of her way to make me feel secure. But there were times when her efforts felt forced, like she was trying too hard to prove something that should have been a given. It only served to remind me of the gap that still existed between us. One evening, a few weeks after we had started counseling, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. It was something we used to do all the time, snuggle up together, lose ourselves in a story, forget about the world outside. But this time, there was a tension between us that neither of us could ignore. We were sitting close, but it felt like there was a wall between us, an invisible barrier that kept us apart. I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers with hers. She squeezed back, but her grip was tentative, hesitant. I glanced over at her, studying her profile in the dim light of the TV. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed with worry and guilt. I knew she was trying. I could see it in everything she did, in every gesture, every word. But the doubt, the fear, the mistrust, it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I frowned, turning to face her fully. "For what?" "For everything," she replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "For hurting you, for breaking your trust, for putting us through this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I know you're sorry, Jess, I believe that. But it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about rebuilding what we lost, and that's going to take time." She nodded, biting her lip. "I know. I don't know how to make it right." Neither do I admitted, my voice heavy with exhaustion. But I'm willing to try, as long as you are. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the determination in her eyes. I am, Mike. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, to fix us. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that we could find our way back to each other. But the fear of being hurt again, of being betrayed, was always there, a constant shadow over my thoughts. It was going to be a long road, and I didn't know where it would lead. But as I sat there holding her hand, I knew that I couldn't give up, not yet. The routine of counseling and cautious rebuilding became our new normal. Life didn't stop moving forward, even though it felt like we were stuck in an endless cycle of painful reminders and tentative steps toward healing. Jessica continued with the yachting competitions, though she made a point of keeping her distance from Daniel, or at least making sure I knew where she was at all times. It felt like we were both trying to navigate a minefield, careful not to set off any explosions that could blow us apart for good. Dr. Lewis suggested that we start doing things together, outside of the sessions, activities that would help us reconnect and remind us of why we fell in love in the first place. It seemed like a good idea, and at first I was hopeful that it would help bridge the gap between us. We started going for walks together, cooking dinner together, trying to rediscover the little things that had once made our relationship strong. But every step forward felt like a step back. The walks were quiet, filled with awkward silences, as we both struggled to find something to say that didn't touch on the pain or the mistrust. The dinners were tense, the air thick with the unspoken thoughts that hovered between us like a dark cloud. It was like trying to dance with a partner who was always half a step behind, always just out of sync. One evening, after another strained dinner, I suggested we go out on the boat, just the two of us. The idea came out of nowhere, and as soon as I said it, I saw the flicker of hesitation in Jessica's eyes. The yacht had always been her domain, her passion, and after everything that had happened, it had become a symbol of the distance between us. But I wanted to reclaim it, to turn it into something that could bring us together again. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "It'll be good for us. We haven't been out on the water together in a long time." She nodded, though I could see the doubt lingering in her expression. "Okay, let's do it." We drove to the marina in silence, the tension between us almost palpable. When we arrived, Jessica moved through the familiar motions of preparing the yacht, her movements quick and efficient, while I tried to find my place in a space that had once felt like home, but now felt foreign and uncomfortable. As we set sail, the wind filling the sails and propelling us out onto the open water, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The water was calm, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but inside I felt anything but peaceful. I wanted this to be a moment of healing, a chance for us to reconnect, but the memories of what had happened, of the betrayal that had taken place on the water, were impossible to ignore. We sailed in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull. I watched Jessica as she steered, her face a mask of concentration. She was beautiful, as she always had been, but now there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a heaviness that weighed on her even in moments of quiet. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Do you still enjoy this?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. She looked over at me, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Sailing, the competitions, everything." I gestured to the water around us. "Does it still make you happy?" She hesitated, her eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge where the question was coming from. "Yes," she said slowly. "It's always been my passion, you know that." "I do," I replied, my gaze drifting out to the horizon. I wonder if it's worth it, if it's worth what it's done to us." Her expression softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Mike, I know that what happened with Daniel was wrong, and I'm not trying to make excuses. But this, sailing, competing, it's a part of who I am. Giving it up wouldn't fix what's broken between us. It would just take away something that brings me joy." I nodded, though her words stirred a fresh wave of anxiety in my chest. "I know, I guess I'm scared. Scared that this is where we'll always be, always walking on eggshells, always looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next thing to go wrong." She reached out, placing her hand on mine. I'm scared too, Mike, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here with you because I want to be, because I want us to work. Her words were sincere, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small light in the darkness that surrounded us. We continued sailing into the evening, the conversation growing easier as the night went on. We talked about everything and nothing, the mundane details of our days, the future, the past. There were still moments of awkwardness, of tension, but there were also moments of connection, of something that felt almost like the old us. As we anchored for the night, the stars twinkling above us in a clear, dark sky, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. It wasn't complete, wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jessica leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder as we sat on the deck, the gentle rocking of the boat lulling us into a comfortable silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax, to breathe, to let go of the fear and the doubt, if only for a little while. I'm glad we did this, she murmured, her voice soft. Me too, I replied, my arm wrapping around her waist. Maybe we can make this a regular thing. She nodded, her hand slipping into mine. I'd like that. As we sat there under the stars, with the sound of the water surrounding us, I realized that this moment of quiet connection, of shared peace, was what I had been missing. It wasn't going to fix everything, wasn't going to magically heal the wounds that had been inflicted. But it was a step, a small but significant step towards something better. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed our night on the yacht were a strange mix of progress and setbacks. On the surface, it seemed like we were doing everything right, going to counseling, spending more time together, trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But beneath it all, there was a tension, a sense of something unresolved, something that neither of us could quite put into words. Jessica and I had fallen into a new routine, one that felt almost normal, almost comfortable. We would wake up together, share breakfast, go our separate ways for work, and then come back home to each other in the evening. We talked more, laughed more, and even managed to find some of the old rhythms that had once defined our relationship. But the shadow of her affair with Daniel lingered, a constant presence that neither of us could escape. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch after dinner, I found myself staring at her, studying her as if I were seeing her for the first time. She was beautiful, as always, her features softened by the dim light of the living room. But there was something different about her now, something that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the guilt or the sadness that had become a part of her since the affair. It was something deeper, something that made me wonder if I really knew her at all. Do you ever think about what happened? I asked suddenly, my voice breaking the silence. Jessica looked up from the book she was reading, her expression caught off guard. What do you mean? Do you ever think about Daniel? About the affair? The words felt heavy on my tongue, like something I had been holding back for too long. She closed her book, setting it aside as she turned to face me fully. Of course I do, she said quietly. I think about it all the time. I think about how much I hurt you, how much I hurt us. But do you miss him? The question came out before I could stop it, the fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally spilling over. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Mike, no, she said finally, shaking her head. I don't miss him. What we had, it wasn't real. It was just an escape, a way to feel something that I wasn't feeling at home. Her words stung, even though I knew she didn't mean them to. And what about now? Do you feel what you need to feel now? She reached out, taking my hand in hers. I'm trying, Mike. I'm trying to find my way back to you, to us. But it's not easy. There's so much that's broken, so much that we have to rebuild. I squeezed her hand, trying to push down the doubt that was rising inside me. I know, but sometimes I wonder if we're just going through the motions, if we're trying to fix something that's already too far gone. Do you think that's true? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know, I admitted, my heart heavy with the uncertainty that had become our constant companion. Some days I feel like we're making progress, like we're really starting to heal, but other days it feels like we're just pretending like we're playing a part in a story that doesn't have a happy ending. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at our joined hands, her thumb tracing circles on my skin. I don't want us to be over, Mike. I don't want to give up on what we had. I don't either, I said softly. But I don't know how to move past this. Every time I look at you, I see what we used to be, and then I see what we've become. And it scares me, Jess. It scares me because I don't know if we can ever get back to what we were. She nodded, her tears spilling over onto her cheeks. I know, I'm scared too. We sat there in silence, the weight of our conversation hanging between us like a thick fog. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. We both knew that. But acknowledging it, speaking it out loud, made it feel more real, more daunting. Eventually, Jessica leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, holding her close, trying to draw comfort from the warmth of her body against mine. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, just clinging to each other, as if we were the only thing keeping each other afloat. But even in that moment of closeness, I could feel the cracks in our foundation, the fractures that threatened to tear us apart. And I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard we tried, we might never be able to repair what had been broken. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally came to a head one Friday night. We had been invited to a party at one of Jessica's colleagues' homes, a casual get-together with drinks, music, and the usual small talk that filled the air at these kinds of events. I wasn't particularly looking forward to it, but Jessica seemed eager to go, so I agreed. The evening started off well enough. We mingled with the other guests and shared a few laughs, and for a while it felt almost like old times. Jessica was relaxed, her laughter genuine, and I found myself enjoying the night more than I had expected. But as the hours wore on and the drinks flowed, the atmosphere began to shift. At some point, I lost track of Jessica in the crowd. I was chatting with a couple of guys near the bar when I realized I hadn't seen her for a while. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach, and I made my way through the house searching for her. It wasn't long before I found her. She was standing in a corner of the backyard, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile, and he was leaning in close, his body language a little too familiar for my liking. I stood there for a moment watching them, the knot in my stomach twisting tighter. Jessica was laughing at something he said, her hand lightly touching his arm, and I felt a surge of anger, jealousy, and fear all at once. It was like a flashback to the moment I had found her with Daniel, the same gut-wrenching realization that something was wrong, that the ground beneath my feet was shifting again. I walked over to them, trying to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel the tension radiating off me. Jessica looked up as I approached, her smile faltering when she saw the look on my face. "Mike, this is Tom," she said, her voice a little too bright, too casual. "He's a friend of Sarah's from work." Tom extended his hand, flashing me a friendly smile. "Nice to meet you, Mike." I shook his hand, my grip a little too firm, a little too tight. "You too," I said, my voice clipped. There was an awkward silence, and Jessica shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. "Tom was just telling me about his trip to Italy," she said, trying to smooth over the moment. "Sounds interesting," I replied, though my eyes were locked on hers, searching for something, a sign, an explanation, anything that would ease the growing sense of dread in my chest. Tom, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued talking about his trip, but I wasn't listening. I was too focused on Jessica, on the way she seemed nervous, on the way she avoided my gaze. The conversation felt strained and artificial, and after a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse us for a moment," I said abruptly, taking Jessica's arm and leading her away from Tom and the rest of the party. We walked into the house, finding a quiet corner in the hallway. I turned to her, my heart pounding in my chest. "What was that about?" Jessica looked confused, her brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" "Tom," I said, the name tasting bitter in my mouth. "You two seemed close." Her eyes widened in surprise, and then a flash of anger crossed her face. "Mike, we were just talking. You're overreacting." "Am I?" I shot back, my voice rising. Because from where I was standing, it looked like more than just talking. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, her frustration evident. "Mike, you can't keep doing this. You can't keep questioning everything I do, every person I talk to. It's exhausting." "Well, excuse me for being a little paranoid," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I intended. But after everything that's happened, can you really blame me? Her face softened, the anger fading as she reached for my hand. I understand why you're feeling this way, Mike. I do. But you have to trust me. If we're going to get through this, you have to let go of the fear, the doubt. I'm trying, I said, my voice thick with emotion. But it's hard, Jess. It's so damn hard. She squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with empathy and sadness. I know, but we have to keep trying. For both of us. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. The trust, the faith in each other that we were trying so desperately to rebuild, was fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. And no matter how much we both wanted to believe that we could make it work, the reality was that the wounds were still fresh, the pain still raw. The rest of the night passed in a blur, the party losing its luster as the weight of our argument hung between us. We left early, the drive home filled with an uncomfortable silence that neither of us seemed able to break. When we finally got home, Jessica went straight to bed, and I stayed up, nursing a glass of whiskey as I sat alone in the living room. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she was telling the truth, that there was nothing more to her conversation with Tom than what she had said. But the doubts, the fears, they were always there, lurking in the background, ready to pounce at the slightest sign of trouble. As I sat there, the alcohol dulling the edges of my anxiety, I realized that no matter how much we tried to move forward, the past was still with us, casting its long shadow over everything we did. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the hope that we could find our way back to each other, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were slowly, inexorably, unraveling. The tension between Jessica and me grew more palpable with each passing day. The incident with Tom at the party had been like pulling on a loose thread, and now, the fabric of our relationship was beginning to unravel. We tried to go on as if everything was fine, but the unease lingered, an invisible barrier that kept us from truly connecting. Our counseling sessions with Dr. Lewis became increasingly difficult. Instead of making progress, it felt like we were treading water, stuck in the same patterns of doubt and mistrust. Jessica was becoming more frustrated, her patience wearing thin as she struggled to understand why I couldn't just let go and trust her again. I, on the other hand, was grappling with the fear that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be able to move past what had happened. One afternoon, after yet another counseling session that had left us both drained and on edge, Jessica suggested we take a weekend trip to the coast. She thought that getting away from our daily routine, from the house and all its memories, might help us reconnect and remind us of why we were fighting so hard to save our marriage. I was hesitant at first, unsure if running away from our problems, even temporarily, would do any good. But the look in Jessica's eyes, the desperation mingled with hope, convinced me to give it a try. We both needed a change of scenery, a break from the constant tension, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to start healing. We packed our bags and headed out on a Friday afternoon, driving in silence for most of the trip. The coastal town we chose was small and quaint, with charming bed and breakfasts, seafood restaurants, and a long stretch of beach that seemed to go on forever. As we arrived, I felt a glimmer of optimism. Perhaps this was exactly what we needed, a chance to leave behind the weight of our problems and just be together. The first evening was pleasant enough. We checked into our bed and breakfast, a cozy place with a view of the ocean, and then walked down to the beach. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. We strolled along the shore, our feet sinking into the cool sand, the sound of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us wasn't as heavy as it had been. It felt almost comfortable, like we were beginning to find our way back to each other, one small step at a time. After a while, we found a spot to sit down, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Jessica leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers lacing with mine. "This was a good idea," she murmured. I nodded, though the words caught in my throat. Yeah, it was. We sat there until the sky turned dark, the stars beginning to twinkle above us. For a moment it felt like everything might be okay, like we could actually leave our troubles behind and start fresh. But even as I held Jessica close, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still off, that there was something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull us under. The next day, we spent the morning exploring the town, wandering through the shops, and enjoying the relaxed pace of life by the sea. Jessica seemed more at ease than she had in weeks, her smile coming more easily, her laughter more genuine. I found myself getting caught up in the moment, letting my guard down, and enjoying the simplicity of being together, without the weight of our problems pressing down on us. We had lunch at a small seafood restaurant by the pier, the salty breeze from the ocean ruffling our hair as we ate. We talked about everything and nothing, reminiscing about the early days of our relationship and sharing memories that had been buried under the rubble of recent events. It was nice, like rediscovering a part of ourselves that had been lost. But as the day wore on, that uneasy feeling began to creep back in. Jessica had mentioned wanting to visit a nearby lighthouse, so we drove out to the edge of town, the road winding along the cliffs with the ocean crashing against the rocks below. When we arrived, we parked the car and started the hike up to the lighthouse, the wind picking up as we climbed higher. The view from the top was breathtaking, the endless expanse of ocean stretching out before us, the waves crashing against the rocky shore below. We stood there for a while, taking it all in, the wind whipping through our hair, the salty air filling our lungs. It should have been a moment of connection, of shared awe at the beauty of the world around us. But instead, I felt a growing sense of unease, like something was about to happen, something that would shatter the fragile peace we had found. As we made our way back down the trail, Jessica was quiet, her expression thoughtful. I tried to brush off the tension, telling myself that it was just the residual effects of everything we had been through. But as we got closer to the car, she suddenly stopped, turning to face me. "Mike, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. My heart skipped a beat, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "What is it?" She looked away, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for the right words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'm not sure if I can keep doing this." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and I struggled to process what she was saying. "What do you mean?" Jessica's eyes met mine, and I could see the tears welling up, her lower lip trembling. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is going to be okay. I thought this trip might help us, that we could find a way to move forward. But being here, seeing how much we've changed, it's made me realize that maybe we're holding on to something that's already gone." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the air leaving my lungs in a painful rush. "You're saying you want to end this? After everything we've been through?" She shook her head, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I don't know what I'm saying, Mike. I feel lost. I want to make it work, I really do. But every time I look at you, all I can think about is how much I hurt you, how much I've ruined what we had." I reached out, taking her hand, desperate to hold on to her, to us. "Jessica, we can't just give up. We've come this far. We can't just throw it all away." She squeezed my hand, her grip tight, but her eyes were filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. "I don't want to give up, but I'm scared that no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to go back to what we were." The words hung in the air between us, the weight of them crashing down on me. I wanted to argue, to convince her that we could make it work, that we just needed more time, more patience, more love. But deep down, I knew she was right. We were both scared, both lost, and no matter how much we wanted to believe that we could fix what was broken, the cracks were too deep, the wounds too fresh. We stood there in silence, the wind howling around us, the ocean roaring below. I felt the tears burning in my eyes, but I blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. I couldn't lose her, not now, not after everything we had been through. But the more I looked at her, the more I saw the truth in her eyes, the truth that maybe, just maybe, we had already lost each other. The drive back to the bed and breakfast was a quiet one, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Jessica's words echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to the idea that she might be ready to walk away, that she might already have one foot out the door. When we got back to our room, Jessica immediately went to the window, staring out at the ocean, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. I watched her for a moment, my heart aching at the sight of her so lost, so vulnerable. I wanted to go to her, to pull her into my arms and promise that everything would be okay. But I knew that would be a lie, and we'd had enough of those between us already. Instead, I sat down on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. The silence between us was heavy, charged with all the things we weren't saying. I didn't know how to fix this, how to make things right again. But I knew that if we didn't talk, if we didn't face the truth head on, we were going to lose each other for good. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the silence. "Jess, we need to talk." She turned to me, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I motioned for her to come sit next to me on the bed, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. We sat there in silence for a few moments, neither of us knowing where to start. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything we had been through. "Do you really think we can't make this work?" I asked finally, my voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. Jessica looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I don't know, Mike. I want to believe that we can, but I'm scared. I'm scared that we're just delaying the inevitable, that no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to go back to the way things were." I reached out, taking her hand in mine, holding it tightly. "Things will never be exactly the same, Jess. We both know that. But that doesn't mean we can't find a new way forward, a new way to be together." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, but it's so hard. Every time I look at you, I see the pain in your eyes, the hurt that I caused. And I don't know if I can live with that if I can keep hurting you like this." "You're not hurting me," I said quickly, squeezing her hand. "Not anymore. The hurt came from the lies, from the secrets. But if we're honest with each other, if we're open, then we can heal. We can move forward." Jessica looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, as if she were looking for something, some sign, some reassurance that what I was saying was true. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me, from a place that still held on to hope, onto the love that we had once shared. "I do, Jess. I believe that we can get through this, that we can come out the other side stronger, more connected, but we have to be willing to fight for it, to fight for us." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the battle playing out in her mind, the struggle between holding on and letting go. Finally, she nodded a small, hesitant nod, but a nod nonetheless. "I want to fight for us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I'm scared, Mike. I'm so scared that we'll just end up hurting each other more." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly, feeling her tears soak into my shirt. "We'll hurt each other if we keep running from this, if we keep hiding from the truth. But if we face it together, if we're honest with each other, then maybe we can find our way back." Jessica clung to me, her sobs shaking her body as she cried against my chest. I held her close, my own tears finally breaking free, falling silently down my cheeks. We sat there for what felt like hours, holding on to each other as if we were the only thing keeping each other from drowning. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm sorry for everything." "I know," I said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "And I'm sorry too, but we can't keep apologizing. We have to start forgiving, start healing." She nodded, a small tentative smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I don't know if it will be easy." "It won't be," I agreed. "But we don't have to do it all at once. We just have to take it one step at a time, one day at a time." Jessica took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as she nodded again. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "One day at a time." We sat there in silence for a while longer, the weight of our conversation hanging in the air between us. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with tension or fear. It was a silence of understanding, of mutual acceptance that we were in this together, that we were willing to fight for our marriage, for each other. As the sun began to set outside our window, casting a warm, golden light over the room, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't the end of our struggles, and I knew we still had a long road ahead of us. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Jessica leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand resting on my chest, and I wrapped my arm around her, holding her close. We sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we were ready to face them, together. The days following our emotional conversation were a mixture of tension and tentative hope. Jessica and I were treading on fragile ground, both of us aware that one wrong move could send everything crashing down again. But there was a shift between us, a determination to make things work, even if we didn't quite know how. We spent the next few days exploring the coastal town, finding comfort in the routine of simple activities, walking along the beach, browsing through small shops, and sharing meals at quaint little restaurants. The small talk came easier, and there were moments when we laughed together, the sound almost foreign after weeks of strained silence. One evening, we decided to take a sailing tour offered by a local company. Jessica seemed especially excited about it, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of being out on the water. I was hesitant, the idea of being on a boat stirring up uncomfortable memories, but I agreed, wanting to support her, and hoping that this experience could be another step toward healing. The boat was a modest-sized sailboat, manned by an older couple who clearly loved the sea. As we set out, the wind filled the sails, and we glided across the water, the town growing smaller behind us. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over everything. The sea was calm, the gentle rocking of the boat oddly soothing. Jessica stood at the bow, her hair whipping in the wind, a smile on her face that I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked free, like the weight of everything had been lifted, if only for a moment. I stayed back watching her, a mix of emotions churning inside me. Part of me was happy to see her like this, but another part of me couldn't shake the memories of how we had gotten here, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed us. As the boat sailed further out to sea, the captain encouraged us to take the wheel, to feel the power of the boat under our control. Jessica eagerly stepped up, and I watched as she took the wheel, her eyes sparkling with excitement. The captain guided her, showing her how to steer, how to read the wind, and adjust the sails. She was a natural, her hands steady on the wheel, her movements confident. For a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the adventurous spirit, the one who was always up for a challenge and who wasn't afraid to take risks. It was a glimpse of the life we had before everything had gone so wrong. And for that brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that we could find our way back to that place, that we could rebuild what had been broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we sat down together at the stern of the boat, the water gently lapping against the sides. Jessica leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, holding her close. It was the closest we had been in weeks, and I didn't want to let go. "This is nice," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind and waves. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice soft. "It is." We stayed like that for a while, neither of us saying anything, just taking in the beauty of the moment. It felt like a reprieve, a brief pause from the chaos of our lives, a chance to just be together without the weight of our problems hanging over us. But even as we sat there, the doubts lingered in the back of my mind, the fear that this peace was only temporary, that it wouldn't take much for everything to come crashing down again. As we sailed back to shore, the lights of the town twinkling in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder if this was just a fleeting moment of normalcy, or if it was the start of something more, something lasting. Only time will tell. The next morning, we woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window, a stark contrast to the calm and peaceful day we had enjoyed before. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of a storm. Jessica seemed restless, her earlier optimism replaced by a nervous energy that she couldn't quite shake. "I was hoping for more sun," she said, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "But I guess the weather has other plans." I nodded, feeling a similar sense of unease. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tension that still lingered between us, the unresolved issues that we had only temporarily pushed aside. We spent the morning inside, the rain steadily growing heavier, the wind picking up as the storm rolled in. Jessica tried to keep herself busy, flipping through a book, but I could see that she was distracted, her mind elsewhere. By the afternoon, the storm had intensified, the wind howling around the building, the rain lashing against the windows. The power flickered a few times, and we were eventually left in dim light, the storm knocking out the electricity. The town had taken on an eerie stillness, the streets deserted as people hunkered down to wait out the weather. As the storm raged outside, the atmosphere inside our room grew thick with unspoken words. The quiet was almost oppressive, the tension between us building until it felt like it was about to snap. Finally, Jessica put down her book and turned to me, her expression serious. "Mike, we need to talk." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, the familiar dread settling in. "What is it?" She took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, about us, about everything that's happened. And I don't think we can keep going like this." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, the air leaving my lungs in a painful rush. "What do you mean?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "We've been trying so hard to fix things, to get back to what we were. But the truth is, I don't think we can. Too much has changed, and no matter how much we try, we can't undo what's been done." I felt a wave of panic rising inside me, the fear that I had been trying to keep at bay finally breaking free. "Jessica, we can't just give up. We've come so far. We've been through so much. We can't just throw it all away." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "I don't want to give up, but I don't know if we're holding on to something that's already gone. I keep thinking about what you said, about finding a new way forward, but I don't know if that's possible." I reached out, taking her hand in mine, holding on tightly as if I could somehow keep her from slipping away. "We can find a way. We just have to keep trying, keep fighting for each other." Jessica shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But what if we're just hurting each other more by holding on? What if the best thing we can do is let go and try to find happiness apart?" The words sent a chill down my spine, the thought of a future without her too painful to bear. "I can't lose you, Jess. I can't." She squeezed my hand, her grip tight, but there was a resignation in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I don't want to lose you either, but I'm scared that if we keep doing this, we'll end up hating each other. And I don't want that, Mike. I don't want to destroy what little we have left." The storm outside seemed to reach its peak, the wind howling louder, the rain pounding against the windows with a fury that matched the turmoil inside me. I felt like I was drowning, the ground shifting beneath my feet, and I didn't know how to stop it. "We don't have to decide anything right now," I said, my voice trembling with desperation. "Let's just take a step back. Give ourselves some time to think. We don't have to make any decisions today." Jessica nodded slowly, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Okay, but we can't keep avoiding this conversation forever. We need to figure out what we're going to do." I nodded, though the thought of that inevitable conversation filled me with dread. "I know." We spent the rest of the day in heavy silence, the storm outside finally beginning to subside as evening approached. The power came back on, and the lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the room. But the tension between us remained a dark cloud that refused to lift. That night we lay in bed together, but there was a distance between us, a chasm that felt impossible to cross. I lay awake long after Jessica had fallen asleep, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. I knew that we couldn't keep going like this, that something had to change. But I was terrified of what that change might mean, of the possibility that it could mean the end of us. And as I lay there in the darkness, the storm finally quiet outside, I couldn't help but wonder if we had already reached the point of no return. The morning after the storm was unsettlingly quiet. The world outside had returned to an uneasy calm, the air thick with the dampness of the night before. But inside, the storm still raged within me. Jessica was already awake when I stirred, sitting by the window, looking out at the gray sky. Her posture was tense, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to brace herself for something inevitable. "Morning," I said softly, my voice breaking the heavy silence. She turned to me, her eyes tired and distant. "Morning." We both knew that the time for avoiding had come to an end. The conversation we had danced around for so long was looming over us, and there was no more space to push it aside. "I think we need to go home," Jessica said after a long pause, her voice steady but devoid of any enthusiasm. "Yeah," I agreed, though the word felt like a stone in my throat. "We should." The idea of returning to our normal lives felt almost surreal, as if we had been living in a bubble that was about to burst. but we both knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. It was time to face the reality of what we had become, to either rebuild or walk away. We packed in silence, the sound of our movements the only thing breaking the oppressive quiet. Every now and then, our eyes would meet, but there were no words, only the unspoken acknowledgement that we were standing on the edge of something irreversible. The drive back was somber, the miles stretching out endlessly before us. Jessica stared out the window, lost in her thoughts while I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I replayed every moment, every conversation, every hurtful word that had passed between us over the past few months. I had no idea what awaited us once we returned home, but the anxiety gnawed at me, eating away at any hope I had left. When we finally pulled into the driveway, our house looked the same as it always had, but it felt different, like a place that no longer belonged to us. Jessica hesitated before getting out of the car, her hand lingering on the door handle. "Do you want to come in?" I asked, unsure of where we stood. The question felt like it held more weight than I intended, as if I was asking if she still wanted to be part of this life, part of us. She nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. "Yeah, I do." Inside, everything was just as we had left it, but the air felt charged with a sense of impending confrontation. We both knew that we couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine, and that we had to address the gaping wound that had been festering between us. We stood awkwardly in the living room, neither of us knowing how to begin. It felt like we were on the verge of breaking apart, the tension almost unbearable. "Jess, I started, but she cut me off, her voice unexpectedly sharp. "Mike, I need to say this." She took a deep breath as if gathering her courage. "We've been through so much, and I know I'm the one who caused all of this. I hurt you in ways I never thought I could, and for that, I'm truly sorry. But we need to be honest with ourselves. Is this something we can really come back from?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of our shared pain. I didn't want to answer, didn't want to acknowledge the reality of what she was saying, but I knew she was right. We couldn't keep pretending that everything could go back to the way it was. "I don't know," I admitted, the words dragging out of me like a confession. "I want to believe that we can, but it's hard. It's hard to trust, hard to feel like we can move past this." Jessica nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I feel the same way, and I keep wondering if we're just hurting each other more by trying to hold on." "I don't want to hurt you," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "But I also don't want to lose you." She looked down at the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I don't want to lose you either. But I think we need to be honest about what we want, about whether we can really make this work, or if we're just delaying the inevitable." I felt a lump rise in my throat. The fear that had been gnawing at me was now impossible to ignore. Do you think we should let go?" Jessica didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the couch and sat down, her posture rigid, as if she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. I joined her, sitting next to her but leaving a gap between us, a gap that felt like a chasm. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about what you said, about finding a new way forward. But I'm scared, Mike. I'm scared that no matter how hard we try, we'll always be haunted by what happened, that we'll never be able to truly move on." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Maybe we can't move on completely. Maybe the past will always be there, a part of us. But that doesn't mean we can't build something new, something different." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to find some reassurance, some sign that I truly believed what I was saying. "And what if we can't? What if we're just setting ourselves up for more pain?" I squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin, the connection that we had once taken for granted. "I don't have all the answers, Jess, but I know that I don't want to give up without a fight. I want to believe that we can find a way, even if it's not the way we imagined." She was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching out between us. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between holding on and letting go, between hope and fear. Finally, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. "I don't know if I'm ready to give up either, but I think we need to take it slow, to really figure out if this is what we both want." I nodded, relief and uncertainty washing over me in equal measure. One step at a time. One step at a time, she echoed, her voice soft but steady. We sat there in silence, the tension slowly easing, replaced by a tentative understanding. We were far from healed, far from certain about what the future held. But we were willing to try, to take the steps toward something new, something that might one day resemble what we had lost. It wasn't a definitive answer, and it wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. But it was a start, a fragile, uncertain start. And for now, that was enough.